Hello, my name is Troy McCormack, and my presentation is on the blood-brain barrier, and we will be delving into exactly what the blood-brain barrier is and how the physiological aspects of this, I guess, organ system would be uh, the best way to put it, reacts within our body. Um, and there's some research being done into it that can help cure some diseases. So we'll be talking about that as well. So the blood-brain barrier is important because it stops the influx of dangerous chemicals into the sensitive brain cells. Um, what this means is we have our normal blood within our body, and it goes to all of our organs and our muscles, and it helps us function. But the brain, being a specialized organ, requires specialized blood. And so what happens is we'll be learning about this in just a couple slides here. Um, the blood-brain barrier protects the blood from getting into the brain and separates it from the cerebral spinal fluid, which is what bathes the brain. Um, how it works is it uses endothelial cells, which are capable of transporting blood and nutrients into that cerebral spinal fluid that bathes the brain. So here we have a nice diagram of the blood-brain barrier. And on the left here, we have the normal blood vessels. And we can see here there's pore passages and lipid-soluble substances are able to go right through it. And there's these water-lined pores here which allow for water to come in. Um, but in the blood-brain barrier, it's a bit tighter. So there's the junctions, there's no pores. So that's the first thing to look at. The second thing is lipid-soluble substances can still go through, but they require cell-mediated uh, transport molecules to do that. And there's these glial brain cells that support the barrier here. And these are important because they are the portions of the brain that are taking in the nutrients to deposit it um, into the rest of the brain and that cerebral spinal fluid that gives the brain its energy. So the term barrier in the blood-brain barrier is a real physical barrier. And this is because these tight junctions that we were discussing are very important to um, to keeping out certain molecules that could damage the brain. Not very many drugs can come through into the brain, and so it's important to remember that the blood-brain barrier acts as that physical barrier to those drugs. Um, So they have to take what's called a transcellular route, everything that goes into the brain through the blood-brain barrier. Um, there are different membranes, the luminal and the abluminal, like albumin membranes, regulate intercellular traffic, and they provide a selective transport barrier. So these things can't come in without being recognized as okay for the brain. And there's also a cascade of enzymes, and there are new things being discovered about just how complicated this blood-brain barrier system is every day. So it's a good area to study, and it's a really good thing to research. So here we have some um, another cross-section diagram here of the brain here, and we see some of the smooth muscle cells that are above the endothelium. So this is one of the part of the brain that actually has some muscles. There's some astrocytes and this thing here called a parasite here, pericyte, not a parasite, but a parasite. If you get a parasite in your brain, that would be a terrible thing. Um, so the blood comes in, and this endothelium here, it allows the blood and all the nutrients to be sucked up in these cilia here, and it gets taken up in here to the parasite into the astrocytes. So it kind of goes up in here, and then it goes into the parasite, and then up into the astrocyte there. So in the previous slide, we mentioned the astrocytes and those endothelial reactions on the blood-brain barrier, and I actually found a really interesting study that had to do with that. So these cerebral microvessels are what are make up the blood-brain barrier, and they have a very important role in the neuronal signaling as well. There's a lot of things that must happen for the nutrients and the blood to take those nutrients into the brain. At present, this is kind of a quote from uh, the astrocyte endothelial interactions of the blood-brain barrier. At present, there is great interest in the association of brain microvessels, astrocytes, and neurons to form functional neurovascular units. And that's an interesting concept because those functional neurovascular units um, are very important for the delivery of drugs that are constantly being made for people who have maybe Alzheimer's or dementia. All these drugs, they have to pass through this blood-brain barrier as well as be safe for the blood-brain barrier. So any drug that we take or anything that we put into our body has to be safe to not pass through it. Alcohol being one of the things that can pass through the blood-brain barrier is something that could be very dangerous and is best to be avoided. Now the brain endothelial cells, which we were going over, um, are very important. Um, these and the astrocytes. So the endothelial cells and the astrocytes is a really interesting interaction that is important to understand exactly what's going on. It's important to understand this because there are pathological conditions and restorative therapies that are going to be emerging here. This was written, almost 13 years ago. So there's a lot of new and improving um, types of medicine that are coming about because of all the research that's being done. And we'll get into some of those in just a minute here. So here is a cross-sectional look at the blood-brain barrier. Um, the blood comes in, it's this blue portion here. So the blood comes in and then it kind of branches out here, goes all in here. And you can see I have a little bit of spillage going on maybe right here. So like that would be maybe indicative of a brain bleed. Let's say your blood pressure gets too high and it's kind of building up and it crosses over into that thing. So this would be a really bad one here because it's so close to the corpus callosum that can really lead to some damage there. See how over here, maybe it'll do some damage to the temporal lobe. Um, you know, there's so much. The prefrontal cortex would be maybe here, a little bit of bleeding there. So much that can happen with the brain. That's why brain injuries are so terrible, because when that blood crosses into that cerebral spinal fluid, it can cause some really massive damage. Also, the cerebral spinal fluid can leak out and cause a puncturing of the into the blood-brain barrier. So maybe there's a spinal cord injury, and that cerebral spinal fluid maybe here, it's kind of bathing the brain here, and it's kind of there's a lot of pressure, and it pops right through, and then now that creates a brain bleed. So uh, it's very important to know if there's been any type of bleeding in the brain. If any of these, say there's a blockage right here, that's a stroke. So that it'll shut down certain parts of that whole process. Um, it's very important to know the anatomy and the physiology of the brain, and this blood-brain barrier is very important. I like to think of it as with this cross-sectional look here, is it looks like a ram's horns. So you can see, um, it's just very. If we take away all these highlights here, you can see pretty easily the kind of formation of that ram's horns right in here. So you can see, this looks like a ram. Maybe if you've ever seen a ram before, you can kind of see how it looks. But that's what I first thought of when I saw that. So, um, just keep in mind that there is easy ways to remember how it looks. So getting into some more of the cutting edge research, this one's pretty recent. Some of the researchers at this research initiative on brain barriers and drug delivery are looking at gold particles as a method for drug dispersal into the brain. Um, and what's going on here is the gold, which is an inert element is able to go into the blood vessel and then transport over and go into the astrocytes and things like that. So here we have the gold particles, and I think the flow is about this way. So we have blood going in, and these are able to cross over that endothelial cells here and um, go into those astrocytes. And so um, it's interesting how all this will come. So here's another diagram of kind of another cross-sectional view of the blood-brain barrier, and you can see these little gold particles here, and how they just go right into the brain cells. Boop. Really, really interesting uh, research is being done on how to maybe take these gold nanoparticles and you know cover them in a drug, kind of like how that the KGB took a kind of like a little BB with ricin in it and was able to shoot the guy in the back of the leg with with a little air gun, and that's how they took him out. Well, I think this is kind of like along the lines of that, but rather than a BB covered in ricin, maybe it's a Alzheimer's medication that's able to transfer into there. Um, there's so much research being done on the blood-brain barrier, and it's such an important aspect of our human physiology that it really is important to take a really good look at it and understand, exactly how it works, what's going on with those nerve cells, how it's able to process. I'm sure there's a lot of funding. It seems like a lot of Scandinavian countries are really interested in the blood-brain barrier. Anybody who's been doing any research on Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's, um, ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, or if you've seen the movie Lorenzo's Oil, um, being able to get those lipids into the brain, being able to get those drugs in the brain that can uh, help restore the function of the brain is important, and being able to get past that blood-brain barrier. Another aspect of the blood-brain barrier is the use of psychoactive drugs. They have to be able to cross into there, like cocaine, heroin, um, THC from marijuana. All of these are able to cross that blood-brain barrier and go directly into the nerve cells. And there's a lot of research being done on how much damage that's doing. Um, there's a lot of also drugs that are the same class of those type of uh, psychotropic drugs that can be helpful in understanding that. So lots of research is being done with with those type of things, but it's very important, I think, for scientists to remain ethical and to stay away from those terrible type of unethical experience using those psychoactive drugs, and maybe use a more nuanced approach, kind of like how the research initiative here has been uh, theorizing using these gold particles. So with that, I thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Um, Next slide is the references. So here's my references slide, and if you have any questions, feel free to message me in the discussion board or anything related to that. The blood brain, I've learned a lot about the blood-brain barrier and how it really is an important thing to understand. Thank you for your time.